She was just a secretary, not the kind who drew attention, not the kind people noticed in boardrooms lined with glass and power. Grace Whitmore worked in the background, quiet, precise, holding everything together while no one asked how she held herself together. Until the morning, she collapsed outside the CEO's office, and everything changed. Why did Elliot Hanover, the billionaire CEO known for his silence and distance, drop everything to carry her in his arms? What did he see in her that others ignored as whispers turned into headlines, and private moments became public scandals? Grace faced a painful choice: disappear like always, or finally choose to be seen. But was Elliot's care just guilt, a distraction, or something real? And when the world demanded he choose between reputation and heart, what would he sacrifice? This is not just a story about romance. It's a story about dignity, about second chances, and what happens when two broken people stop hiding from the world and from themselves. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because some stories are meant to be felt, not just heard. Now, let's begin. Grace hadn't eaten since dawn. Her legs trembled beneath her pencil skirt, the conference room lights spinning like carousel bulbs. Then everything went black. But long before her knees gave way, her mind had already begun to crumble quietly, invisibly. The morning had started, as most did, in a hush of exhaustion. The sun was just breaking over the low, historic rooftops of Charleston when Grace Whitmore slipped into the Hanover Systems building, her heels echoing too crisply against the polished tile floors. She was always the first one in. That wasn't just a habit, it was a survival strategy. 35 years old and already a veteran at holding it all together, Grace had learned that quiet competence was often mistaken for invincibility. Her mother had wandered again during the night. Grace found her at 3:42 a.m., standing barefoot on the back porch in a nightgown, clutching a photo of Grace's father like it was a map home. Alzheimer's didn't rage. It unraveled, and Grace was left to pick up the threads each morning, just in time to iron her blouse and return to the role of the unshakable professional. By 7:15 a.m., she was at her desk. By 8:00 a.m., she had already emailed the analytics team, rescheduled 2 vendor calls, and delivered the updated investor deck to the top floor. By 8:17 a.m., she had forgotten again to eat. The day had a rhythm, and Grace was the metronome. Everyone relied on her to keep things moving, smoothing, staying just shy of chaos. She never stumbled, never hesitated, never let on that she was carrying more than she could hold. That was her secret talent, making the impossible look routine. Until today. By the time the board meeting was set to begin, the tension in her chest had tightened into something physical. The folder in her arms filled with projections, schedules, and precisely tabbed notes felt heavier than it should have. Her vision flickered, the fluorescent lights warping slightly as she approached the conference room doors on the 37th floor. Her breath grew shallow. She paused just inches from the glass handle, blinking hard. She could hear voices behind the door, measured, confident, indifferent. And then came the spinning, a slow, deliberate swirl behind her eyes. Not dramatic, not sudden, just relentless. She thought about the email she hadn't answered, the voicemail from the nurse at the memory care clinic, the coffee she never brewed, the banana browning on the counter. Then the folder slipped from her hand, the papers scattered like leaves in an autumn wind, and Grace followed them to the floor. Her body crumpled softly, a whisper against the hard tile, her head tilted slightly, hair spilling across the hallway like honey on granite, her limbs folded inward as though bracing for something she wouldn't remember. Silence fell, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in corporate spaces, the kind that feels sacred or wrong. Seconds ticked. A young assistant inhaled sharply but didn't move. The VP of strategy took a cautious step back, as if unsure whether this collapse was contagious. Vivian Clark's heels clicked once, then stopped. Her lipstick, still fresh from a touch-up, curled into the faintest frown. And then Elliot Hanover stepped out of the conference room. To most of the staff, the CEO was more myth than man, a legend with silvering temples and eyes like cold steel. He was rarely seen, even more rarely heard. His presence alone could hush a room. But now, he crossed the hallway without hesitation. No barked orders, no dramatic flourish. He simply dropped to one knee beside Grace and placed 2 fingers against her neck. His face, usually unreadable, tightened with quiet alarm. He touched her wrist next, checking her pulse with practiced care, then glanced briefly at the scattered papers without acknowledgement. One arm slipped under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. And before anyone could speak, Elliot lifted her into his arms. The hallway, so often abuzz with urgency, stilled completely. The CEO carried the unconscious secretary past open mouths and stunned stares, not pausing, not explaining. His expression didn't waver, not in anger, not in confusion, only focus, only concern, past the elevators, past the reception desk, past the conference room where numbers and names no longer mattered. He turned down the hallway and disappeared into his private office, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind him with a soft but final thud. The murmurs started the moment he vanished. Grace, of course, heard none of them. Her consciousness returned like mist lifting from a still pond, slow, uncertain, touched with aching light. At first, it was the smell she noticed, something subtle, cedar, maybe, and something else clean, expensive, but unfamiliar. She didn't recognize the ceiling or the softness beneath her head, but she knew the voice that quietly said her name. Even in a whisper, it held weight. Her eyes opened. For a moment, she couldn't speak, not from fear or confusion, but because her mind was still reaching for understanding. Why him? Why now? The last thing she remembered was the spinning, the falling. And now, this. Grace blinked again, lips parting with the question she couldn't yet form. Elliot Hanover sat quietly in the chair across from her, watching, waiting not with curiosity, but with something gentler, something more human than she expected from a man who had once been described as a heart in a $1,000 suit. He didn't say much, but he didn't leave, and in that moment before explanations, before embarrassment, before the inevitable unraveling, Grace realized something terrifying. She wasn't invisible anymore. When Grace opened her eyes, the first thing she saw wasn't the ceiling, it was the soft worry in Elliot Hanover's eyes. And that was more disorienting than the faint itself. The last time someone had looked at her like that was, she couldn't remember. Not since her marriage dissolved in polite detachment. Not since her mother's memory began slipping into shadows. And certainly never in this building, where glances were transactional and concern was a currency no one spent freely. She blinked again, this time slower, adjusting to the low lighting. The fluorescent glare of the hall was gone. In its place was a warm glow lamplight bouncing off bookshelves and leather, the gentle hum of a fan in the corner. She realized she was lying on a long, butter-soft couch. A cashmere blanket she recognized the texture from department stores she couldn't afford was draped lightly over her legs. She shifted, trying to sit up. "Easy?" Elliot said, his voice calm but firm. Not quite a whisper, but not meant for anyone beyond this room. "You fainted outside the boardroom. You've been out for about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Long enough for people to talk." Grace's stomach turned not from weakness now, but from the slow, rising weight of embarrassment. She reached up to smooth her hair, felt the dampness near her temple. Someone had wiped it with a warm cloth. She saw the bowl on the nearby table, the edge of a linen towel resting against porcelain. "Water?" he asked, already standing to retrieve the glass waiting on his desk. She nodded, unsure whether her voice would cooperate. He handed it to her without comment, his eyes briefly scanning her face for signs of another collapse. She sipped, grateful for the coolness, for the way it seemed to reset the parts of her that had gone fuzzy. Grace looked down at her shoes, one slightly askew near the end of the couch, and tried to form an apology. But none of the words she wanted were appropriate. "Sorry I caused a scene. Sorry for being human in a place that punishes it. Sorry you had to carry me." Instead, she said nothing. Elliot, still standing, returned to the chair across from her, his posture more relaxed than she'd ever seen. He didn't reach for a phone, didn't open a laptop. He simply sat. Grace glanced around the room. She had never been inside this office. Few had. It was quieter than she expected. No art meant to impress. No walls cluttered with plaques or certificates. Just a large oak desk, shelves filled with well-worn books, and one photograph turned face down on a side table. She didn't ask about it, but she noticed, and he noticed that she noticed. He cleared his throat. I lost my wife 6 years ago. Stroke. Sudden. She was 38. Grace's breath caught. He said it the way someone might recite an old fact, not with detachment, but with the steadiness of having had to say it too many times. She fainted once, 2 weeks before, he added, almost as an afterthought. No one thought much of it. The room shifted. It wasn't just a conversation now. It was something else. A thread quietly tied between two people who hadn't expected to speak this way today. Maybe ever. Grace stared into her water glass, watching the ripples settle. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above the hum of the fan. I know, he replied. Outside, the day continued. Calls made, emails sent, meetings scheduled. But in this room, time moved differently. More slowly, more honestly. The door opened gently a moment later. Elliot's assistant stepped in, tablet in hand, her eyes scanning the scene with the professionalism of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. The board's ready to resume, she said, voice crisp. Should I push it back? Grace made a move to stand. No, I'm fine. Elliot lifted a hand. Tell them to wait, he said, without looking away from Grace. 30 minutes. The assistant hesitated. Just a beat, enough to show this wasn't routine. Then she nodded and left. Grace stared at him. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said again, simply. She adjusted the blanket over her legs, suddenly aware of how strange this must all look. The CEO of a billion-dollar company delaying a board meeting because his secretary passed out. It didn't make sense, and yet it did. Not in the way corporate protocol understood, but in the way people, at their core, recognize quiet decency. Grace had spent so long being useful, efficient, invisible. She didn't know what to do with kindness that didn't come with strings. For the first time in years, she felt seen. It terrified her. When she finally stood, legs still unsure, Elliot helped without touching, just a slight lean forward, a readiness to catch her again if needed. She steadied herself and nodded, the unspoken thank you passing between them. He opened the door for her, but didn't follow. She paused at the threshold, turning slightly. I'll get back to work, she said, more to herself than to him. He didn't answer, not with words, just a look. It held something she couldn't quite name respect, maybe, or regret. As she walked down the hallway, the stares began, some subtle, some not. Eyes from behind cubicle walls, hushed whispers behind ceramic mugs, the kind of office curiosity that fed on silence and hierarchy. Grace kept walking. She didn't return to her desk. Not yet. Instead, she rode the elevator to the ground floor, stepped out into the sharp autumn air, and exhaled in full for the first time that day. The cab ride home was short and quiet. She sat with her hands in her lap, her thoughts loud but disorganized, somewhere between shame and something more hopeful, something not ready to be named. When she entered her apartment, the first thing she saw was the refrigerator door wide open. Her mother was standing barefoot in the kitchen, squinting into the shelves. James, her mother called softly, her voice lined with confusion. Did you move my slippers again? Grace didn't answer right away, just walked over and gently closed the fridge door, placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. James had been gone 12 years, but for her mother, the calendar no longer applied. Grace didn't cry, not yet. She made tea, guided her mother to the worn recliner by the window, pulled the blanket over her knees. then sat quietly beside her, eyes turned to the fading sky, hands folded in her lap. Somewhere between the white noise of the TV and the ticking of the wall clock, a memory returned. Not a full scene, just a moment. The way Elliot had looked at her, not with pity, but recognition, as if he saw more than the fall, as if he saw her. The next morning, Grace returned to work early, hoping to disappear into her routine. But Elliot was already there, waiting. The office was still half dark, its early morning hush wrapped around the walls like a familiar blanket. Grace stepped into the lobby just after 6:45 a.m., her bag slung over one shoulder, a thermos of tea clutched tightly in one hand. She'd taken extra care with her appearance, subtle makeup, a soft gray blouse, the same watch she wore every day but had polished the night before. She hadn't expected to see anyone. She never did at that hour, but as she turned the corner near her desk, Elliot Hanover stood there, leaning slightly against the edge of her cubicle wall, no tie, just a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He looked, somehow, like he belonged less to the world of boardrooms and more to the pages of a story she didn't quite believe she was living. He didn't speak right away. He just nodded once, eyes warm but unreadable. Then he asked gently how she was feeling. Grace replied with a clipped, "Better," not out of coldness, but because that's all she had the energy to give. Still, the way he looked at her told her he accepted the answer, not because it told the whole truth, but because it told enough. She expected him to move on, to disappear back into his secluded floor of power and glass. But he lingered. "Your mother," he said, as she set her bag down. "Is she doing all right today?" Her hands froze over the zipper, for a heartbeat. Her pulse quickened in confusion. She hadn't told anyone at work about her mother's condition, not explicitly. Maybe someone overheard a phone call, maybe a calendar reminder left open, but no one had ever asked. "How did you?" she began, her voice trailing off. Elliot didn't explain. He just offered a quiet, sincere, "I know a little bit about what it takes to care for someone like that." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. But in that silence, a sliver of understanding passed between them. Grace lowered her eyes, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. And yet, for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel threatening. It felt safe. That day passed slowly, but not unpleasantly. The whispers still followed her co-workers with too much curiosity and not enough discretion, but Grace found herself less affected. Maybe it was the way Elliot nodded as he passed her desk later that morning, or the way he paused in the elevator as she entered, holding the door longer than necessary, offering her a space beside him in the quiet corner. They didn't speak, but in the mirrored panel of the elevator, she caught him glance sideways just once, a look not of ownership or flirtation, but of attention. Real, undiluted attention. It was enough to make her breath catch. By lunchtime, she'd retreated to her favorite spot on the building's rooftop terrace, a place no one else seemed to care for except on warm Fridays. Today, it was gray and breezy. Charleston's fall settling in with soft gusts and golden leaves clinging stubbornly to their branches. She sat with her thermos, letting the steam rise against her cheeks, eyes closed for just a moment longer than necessary. When she returned to her desk, something small sat atop her keyboard. Her notebook, the one she'd left, unknowingly, in Elliot's office the day before. The same one she'd assumed had been tucked away or discarded by an assistant. But it hadn't been. It was returned, carefully. There was a small square of paper tucked beneath the front cover, her name, written in sharp, elegant handwriting. "You're not invisible." 4 words, nothing else. But they reverberated in her chest louder than the most elaborate speech. She didn't smile, not outwardly, but something in her eyes softened. She placed the note inside the inner pocket of her purse, near the emergency cash and the picture of her parents from their 30th anniversary. She didn't know what to call what was happening. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't protocol. It was something quieter, slower, a gentle shift in the gravity of her days. That evening, she arrived home just after sunset. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and cinnamon, the candle she'd left burning too long. Her mother was in the living room, standing in front of the television with the remote upside down in her hands. "Is this the weather?" her mother asked. "No." "Mom?" Grace replied softly. "It's the news." Her mother blinked. Did James call? Grace's hands stilled? She stepped forward, took the remote, guided her mother back to the worn recliner near the window. "No." "Mama," she said, smoothing her mother's cardigan. "James doesn't call anymore." Her mother nodded, distracted by the flickering screen, her mind already drifting to another year. Later. Grace made tea, chamomile with honey. She sat across from her mother, watching her doze off with a small smile on her face. Her fingers still gripped the old wristwatch that once belonged to Grace's father, a habit she'd never let go of. Even as memories faded, Grace reached into her purse and pulled out the note. "You're not invisible." She read it again, this time aloud in the quiet, just above a whisper. As if saying it would make it more true, she glanced at her mother's relaxed face, the creases around her mouth soft in sleep, the watch ticking faintly beneath her hand. Maybe she wasn't invisible, not to everyone. And somewhere, above the city lights, in an office still lit long past closing, Elliot reviewed reports he wouldn't remember but couldn't stop glancing toward the corner of his desk, where her notebook had once rested. It started with whispers, just soft ones. But in an office built on silence, even whispers carry weight. At first, they were just murmurs behind coffee cups, subtle pauses in conversations when Grace passed by, flickers of side eyes exchanged near the elevator bank. Hanover Systems wasn't a place of gossip. It was a place of control. But even in such places, people watched, and when they couldn't understand what they saw, they filled in the blanks themselves. Grace could feel it, the shift, the attention that had once skipped over her entirely. Her presence barely registering in the sea of polished suits and muted heels now followed her, not with admiration, not even curiosity, but with calculation. They were trying to solve a puzzle they didn't have all the pieces to. She tried to act as if nothing had changed. She still arrived early, still reviewed the weekly calendars before the sun crested over the historic rooftops of Charleston, still made coffee the way she always did, 3 sugars, no cream. But even her coffee tasted different now, bitten at the edges by the bitter hint of exposure. The unease grew louder when Vivian Clark returned. Vivian wasn't the kind of woman people forgot. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation. Her perfume lingered in elevators like the afterthought of a sharper conversation, and her eyes, cool and deliberate, missed nothing. She had a way of entering a room that made it feel smaller. Not from presence alone, but from precision. She had been Hanover's head of PR for almost 6 years, though she often disappeared on long, strategic retreats to New York or D.C. Whispers about her and Elliot had surfaced years ago, polished speculation that never quite broke surface tension. Now, she was back, and her gaze landed on Grace like a slow, curious tilt of the head, like a cat regarding a mouse that had wandered too close to the wrong corner. The first encounter came during a mid-morning strategy meeting. Grace was seated quietly near the end of the table, notebook in hand, typing minutes no one else would read, but everyone expected to exist. Elliot entered late, offered Grace a brief nod, and took his seat at the head. Vivian leaned back in her chair, fingers laced elegantly in front of her. "Before we begin," she said, lips curving with amusement, "I just wanted to say how lovely it is to see new energy on this floor. Sometimes, all it takes is a fresh face to remind us what dedication looks like." She didn't look at Grace. She didn't need to. The words hung in the air, delicate and venomous. Grace didn't flinch, not outwardly, but something in her chest pulled tight. She kept her eyes on her screen, fingers still, her pulse louder than the tapping of keys. No one laughed, but no one stopped her either. Elliot said nothing. Not then. Grace didn't expect him to defend her. That wasn't how this world worked, But some part of her, some quiet, aching part, had hoped he might. After the meeting, she walked quickly to the restroom, locked the stall, and sat down fully clothed, just to breathe. Her reflection in the mirror afterward betrayed nothing. She reapplied lip balm with steady hands, adjusted her collar, and returned to her desk with practiced grace. But inside, the doubt was louder now. The whispers had done their job. They had carved space for shame where there had only been silence. The email came just after 6:30 p.m. when the office was nearly empty. No subject line, no name, just a line of text. No wonder you got carried to the top floor. Below it, a grainy photo, her and Elliot, walking side by side in the evening light 2 nights before. Taken from a distance, not intimate, but timed. The sender knew exactly what they were doing. Her throat closed. She stared at the screen for nearly a minute before dragging the cursor to the trash icon. She didn't open the photo again, didn't respond, didn't forward it to IT. She just deleted it. But it stayed with her, long after the lights were off and the building had gone dark. That night, Grace lay in bed, staring at the shadows cast by the window blinds. Her mother had fallen asleep hours before, curled on her side, with a hand still resting protectively over the old wristwatch. Grace's phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. She didn't want to look, but something nudged her. One message, unknown number, but she recognized the signature even without a name. Don't let them dim your light. She stared at the words, hand motionless over the screen. He knew. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't promise to fix it, but he saw her, again, still. She didn't reply, but she didn't delete it either. Instead, she turned the phone face down, rolled over toward the wall, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, it came with the memory of 4 words scrawled in handwriting that had started to feel familiar. Somewhere across the city, in an office that had long since emptied. Elliot stared out the window at the quiet streetlights, one hand resting near his phone, the other holding a folder he hadn't opened in an hour. It wasn't the reports keeping him late. It was what he hadn't said and what he couldn't afford to. The headline blinked at her from the office printer like a slap in the face, CEO Hanover's secret secretary romance. The words were loud even on the silent page. Too bold, too cruel, and too real. Grace stood frozen in front of the printer room, the hum of the machine still vibrating in the air. The paper was still warm when she picked it up, though her fingers felt suddenly cold. There it was, her face, caught mid-step beside Elliot. The angle wasn't flattering, her expression unreadable, eyes downcast, but it was unmistakably her. The photo was grainy, the kind that relied more on implication than clarity. But the headline didn't care, nor did the dozen paragraphs beneath it that speculated freely, painting a narrative far from the truth, but tantalizing enough to spread like wildfire. The article wasn't from a major outlet, just one of those anonymous gossip blogs that fed off corporate whispers and LinkedIn updates. But it had been picked up, shared, circulated. Someone had printed it deliberately and left it there, for her, by 9:00 a.m. It had already made its way around the office. The glances that had once been curious were now sharpened, narrowed with judgment and indulgence. Conversations paused just a second too long when she entered a room. Emails were shorter, smiles tighter. Grace moved through the hallway like someone wading through knee-deep water, every step harder than the last. Every breath caught behind the dam of her chest. She didn't cry, not yet, but her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. At her desk, a crisp copy of the same article lay on top of her keyboard, folded neatly, deliberately. No note, but the scent of expensive perfume lingered on the edge of the page. Vivienne. The message was as elegant as it was brutal. You're not just seen, you're exposed. Grace folded the paper in half, then again, and slipped it into her drawer without a word. Her hands trembled slightly, but she reached for her mouse and opened her email like it was any other day. A calendar invite appeared urgent, private. 10:15 M. From Elliot Hanover. She stared at it for a long moment, then clicked, accept. In the executive wing, the air felt denser. The glass walls seemed colder, less forgiving. Grace entered Elliot's office quietly, the door shutting behind her with a muted click that still seemed to echo. He stood behind his desk, hands in his pockets, not looking at her, but at the skyline beyond the window. Charleston was cloaked in soft fall light, but it felt far away. When he finally turned, there was no anger in his face, only weariness. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, sincere but helpless. Grace shook her head. "It's not your fault. I should have seen it coming," he replied, finally meeting her eyes. The attention, the assumption. Her lips pressed together, the emotion tightening her jaw. "There's pressure from the board," he continued. "Questions from shareholders. Rumors tend to cost more than truth in places like this." She waited. She knew what was coming next, even before he said it. "I want to offer you a temporary leave, paid, just until things quiet down." Grace's heart dropped, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. He was trying to protect her, and it broke her heart. She nodded once, slowly. "I appreciate it. I don't want this to define you," he said, his voice lower now, almost reluctant. "I know," she whispered, "but it already does." There was nothing left to say, at least not in this room. Packing her things was the slowest she'd ever moved at work. Every drawer opened like a confession, every object pens, notepads. The ceramic mug with a chip on the rim felt heavier than it should have. She didn't make eye contact with anyone, but she could feel their stares, warm and invasive, brushing the back of her neck like a second skin. She passed Vivienne in the hallway. The older woman didn't speak. She just smiled with the kind of elegance only cruelty can perfect. Grace kept walking. At the elevator, the doors opened slowly. She stepped in alone, pressed the button for the ground floor, and watched her reflection blur in the metallic walls. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel strong. She didn't feel brave. She just felt small. The ride down was quiet, but inside her, the noise was deafening. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she sat on a bench 2 blocks from the office, near a quiet park where the leaves had begun to pile in soft gold drifts. She watched a mother push a stroller along the path, a man tossing crumbs to pigeons with childlike patience. Normal, unaffected, invisible. She sat there for over an hour. Her phone buzzed once in her coat pocket. She didn't want to look, but she did. It was a text from Elliot. Just a line. "Don't let them make you smaller than you are." She stared at it, her breath catching. This man, so measured, so controlled, was trying in the only way he knew how to remind her she mattered. It helped, but only a little. When she got home, her mother was watching an old sitcom rerun, laughing softly at jokes she'd forgotten were already told. Grace sat beside her, slowly removing her shoes, rubbing her temples with 2 fingers. Her mother turned, confused for a moment. "Did you have school today?" she asked. Grace smiled faintly. "Something like that?" She reached for the old watch still resting on her mother's wrist, brushing a thumb gently over its scratched glass face. For a long time, they sat together like that, 2 women in different worlds, both fighting to hold on to a sense of self. Outside, the world kept spinning, but inside, something had shifted. Grace wasn't sure who she would be tomorrow. But today, she knew exactly who she wasn't. She wasn't a rumor. She wasn't a headline. And she wasn't done. And in a corner office high above the city, Elliot Hanover stared at the screen of his laptop, where the same headlines still glowed. But it was her absence, not the article, that made the room feel suddenly colder. Some goodbyes don't come with tears. They come with silence. And silence is louder than grief. Grace arrived at the office just after dawn. The building was still dark, the echo of her heels the only sound on the polished floor. This time, she didn't come early to stay ahead. She came to leave without a scene. Her desk looked exactly as she'd left it, papers stacked neatly. her favorite pen resting diagonally across the corner of a legal pad, the potted lavender she kept by the window already beginning to wilt at the edges. She stared at it longer than she meant to. It had bloomed in spring, quietly, consistently, a stubborn kind of beauty. She ran her fingers along the desk's smooth surface, her touch feather-light, like a goodbye. She wasn't allowed to speak aloud. One by one, she packed her things. No cardboard box, no dramatic sweep of arms, just her worn leather tote, the one she carried every day for the last 4 years. A book of quotes she kept tucked in the drawer, the mug with the tiny chip near the handle, a USB drive with 2 years of projects she would never claim credit for. She paused at the framed photo of her mother and father, her mother still lucid then, her father's smile like sunlight. She placed it gently in the side pocket of her bag. She didn't expect anyone to come. So, when she heard footsteps measured, deliberate, her breath caught without warning, she didn't turn around. She didn't have to. He stood in the doorway, just inside the threshold. Elliot. He didn't speak, and she didn't offer greeting. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full, like the final note of a song no one wanted to end. She turned, slowly. Their eyes met, not like before. Before, there had been curiosity, quiet warmth, unspoken wonder. Now, there was weight. Grace opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't betray the composure she worked so hard to keep. Her heart was loud, but her face was still. Elliot looked as he always did, measured, elegant, restrained, but something in his posture betrayed him. His hands were in his pockets, his tie slightly loosened, his eyes tired. He stepped forward, one pace, then stopped. She waited, but he didn't speak, so she nodded. A small, respectful gesture, the kind you give someone who once mattered more than they could say. Then she turned back to her bag, zipped it shut, and lifted it onto her shoulder. When she walked past him, he moved aside silently. Their shoulders nearly brushed. Nearly. She didn't look back. Outside, the autumn wind greeted her with a softness that made her ache. She pulled her coat tighter, the chill biting gently through the fabric. The city moved as it always did. Buses groaning at corners, bikes weaving between cabs, morning joggers with headphones and focused eyes. But for Grace, everything felt slower, like the world had stepped one beat off from the rhythm she knew. The ride home was quiet. She sat near the window, fingers curled around the handle of her bag, watching the blur of Charleston's old streets pass by like memories too fast to catch. At home, the apartment smelled of lavender detergent and last night's soup. Her mother was awake, sitting in the recliner by the window, the old watch still on her wrist, a blanket folded neatly over her lap. Grace dropped her bag quietly, toes easing out of her shoes, each step toward her mother, purposeful but gentle. Her mother looked up, eyes blinking slowly in recognition or something like it. "Konbe tok shvang yai," she said suddenly. "No tingang ge them cha kon, no kong hai si il mem ang yu." Grace froze. She knelt beside the chair, taking her mother's hand. "Mama," she said softly, "that was me." Her mother looked at her for a long time, searching, then blinked again, slowly, and turned her eyes to the window. Grace didn't let go of her hand, but the tears came, silently, freely, not from anger, not even from grief, but from that deep, aching place where goodbye doesn't ask permission, it just arrives. Back at Hanover Systems, the morning meetings began on schedule. The elevator chimed politely, keycards blinked, phones rang, and on the 37th floor, Elliot stood by the wide glass window that overlooked the heart of the city. From this height, everyone looked small, but not Grace, not to him. He spotted her near the corner traffic light, coat folded around her, bag slung over one shoulder. Her pace was steady, her head held high, but something in the tilt of her shoulders betrayed the heaviness she carried. He didn't blink. He watched her cross the street, wait at the corner, and then disappear into the flow of bodies moving toward destinations unknown. And for the first time in months, Elliot didn't return to his desk. He walked instead to the credenza behind it, where a single photo frame rested, its back worn, its silver edges polished by habit more than care. Inside it, a photo of his late wife. They had taken it in Savannah 2 summers before she died. She was laughing, head thrown back, sunlight catching the corners of her eyes. He hadn't looked at it, truly looked at it, in months. Now, he lifted the frame, held it, paused, then, slowly, he opened the back, removed the photo, and placed it in a drawer. He didn't throw it away. But he didn't return it to the desk either. The space it left behind was quiet, like the moment after a door closes, or the instant before a heart begins to hope again. The boardroom was colder than usual that morning, not because of the AC, but because Elliot Hanover walked in without his usual detachment. He looked like a man who had already made up his mind. The room was long, minimalist, and lined with high-backed leather chairs that reflected the kind of power few people wielded, but many pretended to. On the far wall, the company's mission statement was etched in brushed steel: innovation, integrity, impact, words that looked cleaner than they ever felt. Elliot took his seat at the head of the table. No folder in hand, no coffee, just the sound of his own footsteps, deliberate and soft, like he was stepping into a storm he had already studied. The board members greeted him with the kind of civility that wasn't warmth. A few nodded, one cleared his throat. 2 looked down at their tablets, scrolling through reports that had already been printed 3 times over. Vivienne was the last to sit. She took her seat with quiet grace, her red leather portfolio snapping shut, as if to say everything that needed saying had already been said. The agenda began with earnings, projections, Q4 concerns. Elliot listened without interruption. His face revealed nothing, though his hands remained folded atop the polished oak table, not fidgeting, not moving, just still. Then came the shift. A soft cough from Chairwoman Ellison, a glance toward Elliot, the kind of pause that signaled something unscripted was about to happen. "We'd like to move to the personnel matter," she said, her voice tight, too polite. Elliot didn't blink. Vivienne leaned forward, not looking at him directly, but her tone carrying just enough weight to matter. "There's concern," she began delicately, "about recent press, about perception, about how personal associations may be clouding executive focus. No one mentioned Grace's name. No one needed to." Elliot's expression remained neutral, but a slight tap began his index finger gently, rhythmically pressing against the wood, like the ticking of a distant clock. Vivienne continued, "Careful as a surgeon, we understand the complexity, but the company's image is at stake. Investors are watching. We need clarity on how you plan to proceed." The room was quiet, not heavy, not hostile, just waiting. Elliot looked up slowly, his eyes scanning the room, not challenging, not defensive, just measuring. "I'm not unaware of the noise," he said at last. His voice was low but firm, each word deliberate. "But noise is not the same as truth," Chairwoman Ellison interjected gently. "It's about public trust, Elliot, stability." Again. He nodded, but this time, he leaned back in his chair. The tapping stopped. "And how do we define stability?" he asked softly. "Is it silence, conformity, pretending people don't matter unless they sit at this table?" A flicker passed across Vivienne's face, something between irritation and curiosity. "We're not questioning your leadership," someone else added too quickly. "No," Elliot said, "you're questioning my humanity." The room shifted. He paused, then looked down at his hands for a moment, letting the silence breathe. The weight of that silence wasn't accidental. It was chosen. And then, with a calm steadiness, he spoke, "I will not apologize for seeing value in a person others chose not to see." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend Grace. He didn't mention her name, or the emails, or the headlines still floating like smoke around the building. He just said it and let it hang in the air, proud and unbending, No one responded, not immediately. Vivian sat back in her chair, her nails resting lightly against the rim of her coffee cup. She didn't smirk. She didn't press. Because she knew that, when Elliot spoke like that, there was no persuading him, Chairwoman Ellison eventually cleared her throat. "Well," she said, reshuffling her papers, "we'll note your position. Thank you." And just like that, they moved on to vendor negotiations. But something in the room had changed. After the meeting, Elliot didn't return to his office immediately. He walked the long corridor outside the boardroom, his footsteps slow, the echo of his declaration still reverberating behind his ribs. There was no victory in what he said, just honesty. And for a man who had built his career on keeping his emotions out of the room, that kind of honesty cost more than most would ever know. When he finally sat at his desk, he didn't reach for the report stacked neatly on the corner. He didn't touch the glass of water someone had left at his elbow. Instead, he opened his laptop. There, buried beneath dozens of flagged emails and digital memos, was an old message from Grace. He had read it before, weeks ago, but now he opened it again, slowly. It wasn't long. She had sent it the evening after he returned her notebook. It had no subject line, just a few lines. "Thank you for seeing me, for noticing. Most days, I feel like a shadow passing through this building. You didn't have to do what you did, but you made me feel like I wasn't invisible, and that's something I didn't know I needed until now." He read it 3 times, then leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. People talked about leadership like it was about strategy, control, optics. But today, in that boardroom full of power and posture, he remembered something else. Leadership is also about choosing what kind of man you're willing to be when the room gets quiet. In her small kitchen, Grace poured tea into her mother's favorite cup, one with a chip at the rim. The same cup her mother used every morning when her memory still followed the rhythm of time. Outside, the mail slot clinked against the door with a soft thud. Nothing unusual, just another sound and another quiet morning. But this time, something about it tugged at her attention. She set the teapot down carefully, steam curling upward into the sunlight, streaming through the window. Her footsteps were slow on the hardwood floor, slippered but deliberate. When she opened the door, the usual stack of flyers and bills greeted her, and then beneath it all, a single envelope, cream-colored, heavyweight paper, no return address, only 2 letters printed neatly in the upper left corner, E.H. Foundation. Her breath caught. It was subtle, barely a pause, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the envelope. She stood there for a moment longer, staring at it, then closed the door, silence folding in around her again. She didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, she finished making tea, stirred in just the right amount of honey, her mother's preference, and carried it to the living room where the morning news played softly, its words mostly lost in the noise of memory. Her mother sat curled in her chair, hair pinned in soft silver waves, her eyes drifting from the television to the window, searching for something only she could see. Grace placed the cup gently in front of her. "Is it Tuesday?" her mother asked. Grace smiled. "It's Thursday, Mama." Her mother blinked. "That's right. That's when you were supposed to get married." The words landed like dustlight, but impossible to ignore. "I never planned a wedding," Grace replied softly, sitting beside her. Her mother turned to her, brows furrowed. "But you had that man, that tall one, with the quiet voice." Grace looked down at her hands. There was no tall man, not one who stayed. And yet, maybe, for a flicker of time, there had been someone who made her feel less alone in the world. Her mother reached for her hand, pressing her thumb gently into Grace's palm. "He brought you flowers once. Tulips, I think." Grace smiled faintly. "I think that was a dream." "Mama?" Her mother smiled back. "Dreams are still real somewhere." Later, when the dishes were washed and her mother had drifted into her late morning nap, Grace sat by the window with the envelope in her lap. She traced the edges, studying the seal before finally breaking it with the tip of her nail. Inside, a letter typed on formal stationery. Dear Ms. Whitmore, the E.H. Foundation is launching a new initiative to support women re-entering the workforce after periods of caregiving, loss, or transition. Based on your background and recent experience, we would be honored to offer you a leading role in our pilot program, including the design and facilitation of community-based workshops. We believe your voice, your insight, and your quiet strength can change lives. Enclosed is a modest honorarium to support your time and travel. Should you choose to accept, our team will coordinate your schedule around your personal commitments. Grace exhaled slowly. No contact name, no signature, just a postscript handwritten at the bottom of the page. You helped me find a reason to show up for life again. E. She read it twice. Then again. The handwriting was small, controlled, but unmistakably his. Elliot. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even direct. But somehow, it felt like more than either. A gesture not of apology or longing, but of faith. That afternoon, Grace pulled out her laptop for the first time in weeks. She opened a new document and typed a title in bold workshop proposal, Women Finding Their Way Back. She didn't know if she had all the answers, but she had stories and scars. And the quiet kind of wisdom that comes not from triumph, but from surviving the long, silent stretches when no one is watching. She began sketching ideas, small circles, conversation starters, exercises that didn't ask women to be strong, but to be honest, to speak, to be seen. The next morning, she stood in front of the brick building that housed the community center. The fall breeze tugged at the edge of her coat. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the smell of old paper and fresh paint mingled in the air. She held the letter in one hand, her notes in the other. For a moment, she didn't move. The weight of being visible again pressed gently on her chest. But this time, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like return, like re-entry into a life she had quietly walked beside for too long. She pushed the door open. In the distance, the bells of St. Mary's rang 11 times. And somewhere across the city, in an office filled with quiet space and stronger light than before, Elliot Hanover glanced at his watch, then back at the photo now pinned to his corkboard, an invitation mock-up from the E.H. Foundation's new workshop series. No name, no logo, just a title, Becoming Visible. He smiled to himself and returned to work. No one expected Elliot Hanover to speak at the company's gala. His name had been printed at the bottom of the program, listed under executive remarks, but most assumed he'd delegate. That's what he did. Now stay behind the curtain, let others smile for the camera, keep his thoughts to himself. Hanover Systems had grown accustomed to his silence. But that night, under warm string lights strung across the glass atrium and an uncertain sky above, Elliot stepped onto the stage, no teleprompter, no prepared speech, just truth. The room quieted instantly, not because he demanded it, but because Elliot Hanover rarely took up space like this. When he did, people listened. The annual gala had unfolded as expected, clinking glasses, polished speeches, laughter loud enough to mask the tension beneath the surface. Hanover Systems had recovered well on paper since the headlines. Stock prices held, clients remained, but internally, there were fractures, hairline cracks only visible to those who looked too closely. Vivian Clark moved through the room like a practiced flame, elegant, composed, trailing interest wherever she passed. Reporters angled for her comment. Socialites leaned in close. She posed just beneath the chandelier for photos, her expression timeless. And then the lights dimmed, the music faded, and the spotlight turned toward the low platform at the front of the room. Elliot stepped into it. No one knew where he had been. Rumors said he'd taken time off. Others said he was preparing to step down. That night, neither seemed true. He approached the microphone without a note in hand, just his posture upright, sure, and a glint in his eyes that hadn't been there in months. He looked out over the crowd, familiar faces, colleagues, shareholders, strangers, and near the back, he saw her. Grace had come late. She hadn't planned to attend. The invitation sat untouched for weeks, gathering dust between unpaid utility bills and reminders for her mother's prescriptions. But something about the letter from the E.H. Foundation lingered in her bones. It felt like a door had been left ajar, and she owed it to herself to peek through it. She stood near the exit now, her coat still draped over one arm, unsure if she would stay, until she saw him walk on stage. Her breath caught, and she stayed. Elliot cleared his throat once, then began. "No one here needs reminding of where Hanover Systems came from," he said, voice smooth but steady. "And I won't waste your time retelling the metrics we've all memorized." A ripple of polite laughter passed through the room. "But I will say this growth without people is just numbers. And somewhere along the way, I started measuring the wrong things." He paused, letting that land. Innovation and profit, they're important, but they're not enough. Not when we forget the lives behind the progress. Another pause. His eyes didn't scan the room. They locked, intentionally, on the back corner, on her. "There was a moment several months ago," he continued, "when a woman collapsed outside a boardroom. Most saw it as an inconvenience, a disruption, an embarrassment. He let the silence expand. I saw something else." He stepped slightly forward from the podium now, breaking the formal line between stage and floor. "I saw someone who showed up every day for others without ever asking for herself to be seen. I saw a human being stretch beyond her limits, still holding things together for everyone else." No one moved. Vivienne, seated at the center table, stiffened slightly. Elliot continued, "And I failed to recognize her strength not just in that moment, but every day before it. I mistook her silence for simplicity. I let her disappear." Grace stood still. Her fingers clutched her coat tighter, as if anchoring herself to something solid. "I'm not naming her here," Elliot said, "because this isn't about one person. It's about all the people like her, the ones we overlook, the ones who walk past us in the hallway, who carry burdens we never ask about, who show up, even when no one notices." He let out a slow breath. "And if we, as a company, or as leaders, or as human beings fail to recognize those people, then we've failed altogether." There it was, not loud, not dramatic, just truth, clear, unapologetic. He took a moment, glancing toward the side of the stage where the soft glow of candlelight flickered in tall glass cylinders. "I stand here tonight not to defend my choices," he said, "but to acknowledge them." And then his voice dropped slightly. "She changed me, not with ambition or strategy, but by simply being kind, by showing up, even when it cost her." A pause, a silence so thick it pressed against the windows. "She reminded me why I started this company, and why it matters." He stepped back from the microphone. No applause, not yet. Just the hum of hearts quietly realigning, and then, softly one clap, then another, until the room filled with restrained but genuine applause. Elliot nodded once, then stepped down. From across the room, he met her eyes. Grace didn't smile, didn't move, but her eyes shimmered wet, full, overwhelmed. She hadn't expected this, to be named without a name, to be seen without being called out. She looked down quickly, brushing at her cheek, the tears there unnoticed by all but him. And in that fraction of a second, their gaze still locked across the room, Elliot saw her gratitude, and her quiet strength, and the small, unmistakable flicker of something returning. Sometimes the loudest declarations don't come with fanfare. They come in the form of truth spoken plainly, under soft light, in front of people who finally begin to understand. He didn't knock. He just waited by her gate, under the porch light, holding nothing but his quiet conviction. The sky was a soft gray, touched with hints of lavender fading into dusk. Street lamps buzzed with the low hum of early autumn evenings. The wind carried the faint scent of cut grass and old earth, the kind that lingered in small towns like Charleston, especially in neighborhoods where life slowed down after 6 p.m. Grace noticed the figure as she closed the curtains. For a moment, she froze not out of fear, but recognition. He didn't shift his weight or glance at his watch. He just stood there, still, patient. And so, she opened the door. They didn't speak right away. Grace stepped out quietly, pulling her cardigan tighter across her shoulders. She didn't ask why he came, didn't make space for pleasantries. She just walked down the porch steps and stood beside him, their feet inches apart, the old wood beneath them creaking like it remembered something, too. He turned slightly, offering a small nod. She returned it, then, without a word, she gestured toward the 2 wooden chairs on the porch, the same ones she and her mother used when the evenings were mild and memory was kind. They sat. The silence that settled wasn't heavy. It was something else, familiar, gentle, like the pause between 2 pages of a book you don't want to end. The garden stretched out in front of them, wild and unkempt, dandelions tangled with old rose bushes, and a stubborn sunflower bowed under its own late bloom. A wind chime tinkled softly somewhere beyond the porch. Grace spoke first. "I used to sit here after putting Mama to bed," she said, just breathing, pretending this little patch of quiet was enough. Elliot didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was low. Sometimes enough doesn't feel like enough until it's gone. She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. There was soil beneath her fingernails from repotting basil earlier that day. "I thought I'd feel angry if you ever showed up here," she said, almost to herself. "Are you—" "No." A beat passed. "I'm tired," she said. "So am I," he replied. They sat in the softness of that shared truth. Then Elliot leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped like he was holding something too fragile to drop. "I came here tonight," he began, "not because I had something to fix, but because I realized I'd been trying to fix the wrong things." Grace turned toward him slightly, the light from the porch lamp casting gold along her cheekbone. "I've spent my life managing optics, controlling outcomes. I thought respect was something you bought with precision and distance." He looked up then, meeting her eyes. "But lately, I've come to see that being respected doesn't mean being known, and it certainly doesn't mean being needed." Grace didn't reply, not yet. She let the weight of his words find their place. Elliot leaned back. I stepped down. That made her blink. From the board, she asked quietly. "From everything, CEO, chairman, oversight roles. I'll still be a silent partner, but I won't be running anything anymore." Grace's brows furrowed, not in shock, but in wonder. "Why?" He looked out into the garden, eyes scanning the shadows of ferns and fading blooms. "Because I finally asked myself where I'm supposed to be," he said. And the answer wasn't inside a glass building downtown. Grace's breath hitched softly. "I chose," he added, "to be where I'm needed, not just where I'm respected." A hush fell again, this time heavier, not with discomfort, but with understanding. Grace turned her gaze back to the yard, where fireflies had begun their quiet dance among the weeds. "My mother asked me last week if it was my wedding day," she said. Elliot smiled gently. "Did you say yes?" "I told her maybe one day." He nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. More silence. And then Grace, slowly, carefully, placed her hand over his. It wasn't dramatic. No music swelled, no tears fell, just the slow, deliberate choice of contact, of returning, of letting a moment mean something without needing it to mean everything. Elliot didn't move, just curled his fingers gently beneath hers, and together, they sat under the porch light, not speaking, not deciding, just being. Spring came early that year, or maybe it just felt that way because Grace had started planting again. The air carried a different kind of warmth, now gentler, more forgiving. The kind that invited windows to stay open longer and made old floorboards creak with softer steps. It was still too early for full blooms, but the soil had loosened and the robins had returned. Even the weeds seemed a little kinder. Grace knelt in the garden bed she'd neglected for years. Her fingers moved slowly, pressing seeds into shallow rows, the tips of her nails dark with dirt. She wore old jeans, the knees patched from past seasons, and a flannel shirt faded at the cuffs. Beside her, a trowel rested against a stack of terracotta pots, and an open packet of marigold seeds fluttered in the breeze. Behind her, in the living room window, her mother sat quietly with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of tea resting in her hands. She wasn't always present, not fully, but today. Her eyes followed the movement in the garden, and when Grace looked up, their eyes met through the glass. Her mother smiled. It wasn't the wide, knowing smile from before, but it was there. That was enough. Elliot arrived without knocking. He let himself in through the side gate, as he often did now, his presence as natural as the breeze. He wore a navy sweater rolled at the sleeves and soft, worn jeans, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. He stopped just inside the fence, watching Grace for a moment before she noticed him. She looked up and gave a quiet grin. "You're late," she said. "I brought coffee," he replied, holding up 2 paper cups. She accepted one gratefully, setting her gloves aside and sitting on the edge of the garden bed. He joined her, their shoulders brushing. They didn't need to speak much. There was no urgency in their time now, no expectations clinging to their silence. Just the soft rhythm of 2 lives learning how to share space. Elliot reached into his canvas bag and pulled out 2 small lavender plants, already sprouting. "Thought we could give these a try." Grace took one, turning it in her hands. "They remind me of Provence," she said. "You've been—" "No," she smiled, "but I read about it once." He smiled too, gently. "Well," he said, "then we'll bring Provence to Charleston. Later." They moved inside. Dinner was simple roasted vegetables, warm bread, and Grace's homemade lentil stew. The table was set on the back porch, where the last light of day stretched long shadows across the planks. Wind chimes sang a lazy tune, and a candle flickered between them. Her mother had gone to bed early. The house was quiet now. Elliot poured her a glass of wine, then one for himself, their glasses clinking lightly in the hush. Grace leaned back in her chair, bare feet tucked beneath her, and sighed. "Sometimes I forget what peace feels like," she said softly. Elliot didn't answer right away. He reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a small velvet box. Not grand, not ornate, just a box. He didn't open it, didn't push it across the table with any declaration. He simply set it down, between them, still closed. Her eyes shifted to it slowly. He watched her not with anticipation, but patience. "I'm not asking," he said, voice low. "Not unless you want me to." She didn't touch the box. Not yet. Instead, she looked at him. Really looked. At the quiet steadiness in his gaze. At the way his hands rested on the table weathered. Calm. At the lines on his face softened not by time, but by intention. Then, finally, she reached out not for the ring, but for his hand. "I don't need a question," she said. He didn't respond, just turned his palm upward so hers could rest in it. Together. They sat as the sun dipped behind the fence, and the last light of spring folded itself into the folds of twilight. When they finally stood to go back inside, Grace picked up the small velvet box. She didn't open it, didn't say yes or no. She simply placed it on the kitchen windowsill right beside the potted basil, and that was enough. For now. The last time she walked into that boardroom, she fainted. This time, she walked in holding Elliot's hand, and her head was held high. The air smelled different today, not of tension or varnished fear, but of lavender from the vases lining the hallway. A small, deliberate touch Grace had insisted on. The scent of something growing again. The boardroom had been repurposed for the day, transformed into the opening ceremony of Hanover Community Resource Center, a partnership between the E.H. Foundation and the local municipality. Rows of chairs filled the once sterile space. Sunlight poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, falling gently across freshly printed programs, each bearing the same line at the top, You are not invisible." Grace took a slow breath as she entered. Elliot walked beside her, not in front, not behind. With her? No one whispered this time. Because this time, she wasn't a rumor. She was the reason the room had gathered. In the front row, her mother sat upright in a pale lavender sweater Grace had knit 2 winters ago. Her eyes were alert today, wide and clear. Though a bit overwhelmed by the crowd, Grace caught her gaze and gave a small wave. Her mother's face lit up, a recognition bright in her eyes. "Gracie," she mouthed, and Grace nearly forgot how to breathe. The podium was simple, unadorned wood, no flashing lights or projected slides, just Grace, standing tall, notes folded neatly in one hand, the other resting gently over her heart as she took a quiet pause before speaking. "When I left this building months ago," she began, "I thought I'd disappeared." She looked out over the room, not from the company, from myself. A hush settled deeper. This center isn't about a romance. It's not about headlines or redemption stories. Her voice stayed steady. It's about being seen, about standing back up when the world expects you to fade away. She glanced toward her mother. About finding your voice when even the people you love forget your name. Her mother clapped softly then, just once, then again. The room followed. Tears gathered at the corners of Grace's eyes. But she kept going. "I spent years learning how to disappear in plain sight. I let exhaustion become routine, let silence become survival. But someone saw me." She glanced toward Elliot, and that changed everything. She smiled, slow and sure. "This center is for every woman who ever held things together while falling apart. For every caregiver, every overlooked worker, every invisible fighter." Her hand trembled slightly as she unfolded her closing line. "We see you, we honor you, and we are building a world where your story matters." When the applause ended warm, standing, sustained, Elliot stepped quietly beside her. He didn't take the microphone, didn't make it about himself, but when someone in the crowd asked him to speak, just briefly, he nodded and stepped forward. His voice didn't rise, it lowered, calm, measured. "I built a company that reached far, but I lived a life that stayed small." He looked down, then up again. "Grace Whitmore changed my world, but more than that, she helped me find my way home." His words didn't need flourish, because they were real. After the speeches, there were photos, handshakes, journalists with recorders, local officials praising the vision, but Grace only half heard any of it. She was focused on her mother, who now stood slowly from her chair and began walking toward her with the help of a volunteer. When they reached each other, Grace knelt, and her mother cupped her face with both hands. "Gracie," she said clearly, "I'm proud of you." Grace closed her eyes. "I know, Mama." And for that moment, it was enough. The sky darkened earlier than expected that day. A spring rain crept in like a whisper, brushing soft against windows and rooftops. Outside the building, the crowd thinned. Umbrellas opened. Laughter echoed against the glass. Staff packed up signs and folded chairs. The petals of the marigolds and the planters curled slightly at the touch of drizzle. Grace and Elliot stood beneath the awning. She looked up at the gray sky, then back at him. He removed his coat without a word and draped it over her shoulders. Not hurriedly, just naturally, as if he had always been meant to do so. She pulled it tighter. They began walking toward the parking lot, hand in hand, no cameras, no stage, just the sound of their footsteps and the soft patter of rain on asphalt. At the edge of the lot, she paused. The raindrops darkened her hair, and she didn't brush them away. He looked at her, waiting. She turned to him, eyes steady, voice barely above the hush of rain. "Why did you stay?" she asked. He stepped closer, just enough for his breath to warm the space between them. "I never left," he said, and then, as if the world had finally grown quiet enough to hold a single promise. "Always," he whispered, and this time, she believed him. Not all love stories are built on lightning and fire. Some are planted quietly, in broken soil, watered by resilience, and grown in the light of finally being seen. Sometimes, the most powerful love stories aren't about passion or grand gestures. They're about being seen, truly seen for who we are, especially when we feel invisible. Grace's journey reminds us that dignity isn't something we ask for. It's something we carry, quietly, through every hard morning and silent sacrifice. And Elliot's path shows that no amount of success or wealth can replace the simple, aching need to be needed not for what we do, but for who we are. This story isn't just about romance. It's about showing up when it's easier to disappear, about choosing kindness over reputation, and about finding home not in a place, but in a person who says, "I see you. I believe in you. I'm staying," in a world that moves too fast. This is a gentle reminder. The slowest choices built on care, courage, and quiet presence are often the ones that last. And maybe, just maybe, it's never too late to be seen, never too late to start again, never too late to whisper or hear the word always. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we hope you'll help us share it. Like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us what truly matters. At Shining Stories, we believe in the quiet power of human connection, and we're so grateful you're here.